Hey, welcome to the long way through scripture. I'm Catherine Schaefer. This is a slow walk through the Bible. It's not rushed. There's no pressure. Just one section at a time, letting it unfold as it does. Each week, we're not trying to master scripture. We're simply learning how to stay with it a little longer than we normally would, allowing the story to speak before we rush ahead. If you're following along and want something to help you process what you're reading, there is a companion workbook for this podcast. It's simple and steady, just something to help you reflect and stay grounded in the text as you go. You can find it in the show notes at the link provided. And I'm really glad you're here. So let's begin week 23, Ezekiel. If Jeremiah and Lamentations brought us to the moment of Jerusalem's fall, Ezekiel takes us somewhere else entirely. The city has been conquered, the temple has been destroyed, many of the people have been carried away from the land they called home. The story now unfolds among those living in exile, far from everything that once felt familiar. That setting matters because exile was not simply a change of address. For many people, it felt like the collapse of their entire understanding of life with God. The temple was gone. The city that had stood at the center of their identity was gone. The routines and landmarks that had shaped generations were gone. Questions naturally followed. Had God abandoned his people? Could they still worship him in a foreign land? Was the story over? Those questions sit underneath much of Ezekiel. The book opens in a way that can catch readers off guard. If you've recently come through Jeremiah and Lamentations, you might expect a continuation of the same style. Instead, Ezekiel begins with one of the most unusual visions in Scripture. There are living creatures, wheels within wheels, movement in every direction, flashes of light, and imagery that feels difficult to picture clearly. For many people, this is where Ezekiel becomes intimidating. The important thing to remember is that Ezekiel is not trying to give us a blueprint to draw. He is using imagery to communicate something bigger than ordinary language can easily express. The vision points to the majesty, power, and presence of God. Most importantly, it reveals that God is present even in exile. That may not sound surprising to us because we already know how the story unfolds. But for the people hearing Ezekiel's message, this was enormous. They had associated God's presence with a specific place for so long that many struggled to imagine him working anywhere else. Ezekiel's opening vision announces that God has not been left behind in Jerusalem. That truth continues to unfold throughout the book. While many people are focused on what they have lost, God continues speaking. While circumstances have changed dramatically, God's authority has not changed at all. One of the recurring themes in Ezekiel is responsibility. God repeatedly reminds the people that their situation did not arrive without warning. Generations of choices have contributed to where they now find themselves. Yet Ezekiel is careful to move beyond simply blaming the past. Again and again, the focus returns to the present response of the people standing before God. This becomes especially clear in the passages where Ezekiel is described as a watchman. In ancient cities, a watchman stood on the wall looking for danger. If trouble approached, it was his responsibility to sound the warning. Ezekiel is given a similar role spiritually. He cannot control how people respond to the message, but he is responsible for delivering it faithfully. There is something helpful about that image because it reminds us that obedience and outcomes are not always the same thing. Ezekiel's task is faithfulness. The response belongs to those who hear. As you move through the book, you'll encounter a number of unusual actions. Ezekiel lies on his side for extended periods. He builds miniature representations of Jerusalem. He acts out scenes that seem strange to modern readers. These symbolic actions often leave people wondering what exactly is happening. In many ways, they function like visual sermons. The people have heard warnings before. They have listened to prophets speak. Ezekiel's actions become dramatic illustrations designed to capture attention and communicate truth that words alone are no longer accomplishing. They are unusual because the situation itself is unusual. The nation is living through a crisis that generations never imagined would happen. One of the most sobering sections of the book involves the departure of God's glory from the temple. Earlier generations had often assumed the temple guaranteed security. Ezekiel's visions challenged that assumption directly. The building itself was never the source of safety. The relationship with God was what mattered. Watching God's glory depart becomes a powerful picture of the spiritual reality that had already been developing beneath the surface for years. Yet, even in these difficult chapters, judgment is never the entire story. Running alongside the warnings are repeated promises that God is not finished with his people. This is where Ezekiel begins to move towards some of the most hopeful passages in the book. One of those promises appears when God speaks about giving his people a new heart and a new spirit. The problem has never been a lack of information. The people already knew many of God's commands. The deeper issue was internal. Their hearts had become resistant. The promise of a new heart points to a transformation that begins from the inside out. That theme should sound familiar because it echoes what we encountered in Jeremiah. Even while judgment is unfolding, God is already speaking about renewal, already pointing toward a future where his people will experience something deeper than external obedience. Then we arrive at one of the most memorable visions in all of Scripture, the valley of dry bones. Even people who have never read Ezekiel often recognize this image. The prophet is brought into a valley filled with bones scattered across the ground, not recently deceased or wounded, bones that have been dry for a very long time. The picture is intentionally hopeless. Nothing about the scene suggests life, possibility, restoration. Then God asks Ezekiel a question. Can these bones live? It's a remarkable moment because the obvious answer appears to be no. Yet Ezekiel has learned enough about God to respond differently. He places the answer in God's hands. What follows is one of the most powerful images of restoration in the Bible. The bones come together, life returns. What appeared completely beyond recovery becomes alive again. The vision speaks directly to people who feel as though everything has been lost. Exile has convinced many that their future is finished. God responds by showing that He specializes in bringing life to places that appear beyond hope. The image continues to resonate because most of us eventually encounter situations that feel impossible, relationships that seem beyond repair, circumstances that appear permanent, seasons where hope feels difficult to hold. The Valley of Dry Bones reminds us that God's ability to restore is not limited by what we currently see. As the book moves toward its final chapters, the focus broadens even further. Ezekiel begins describing a future restoration that stretches beyond the immediate return from exile. The imagery becomes expansive, filled with visions of renewal, worship, healing, and God's presence dwelling among His people. Some sections are challenging to interpret in every detail, and faithful Christians have reached different conclusions about certain passages. Yet the larger message remains remarkably consistent. God is moving toward restoration. Judgment does not have the final word. Exile does not have the final word. Failure does not have the final word. The book closes with one of the most beautiful names given to a city in Scripture. The Lord is there. After everything that has happened, after exile, loss, judgment, and uncertainty, the final emphasis is not on buildings, borders, or political power. It is on God's presence. That feels fitting because Ezekiel begins by showing us that God is present in exile and ends by reminding us that His presence remains the ultimate source of hope. As you read through Ezekiel this week, don't worry if some of the imagery feels unfamiliar. Allow yourself to sit with the larger themes. Notice how often God speaks into places where people feel defeated. Pay attention to the repeated promise of renewal. Watch for the ways God's presence continues to appear in circumstances where many assumed He could no longer be found. The reflection to carry with you this week is this: God is not limited to the places where we expect to find Him. The people in exile assumed they had lost everything that mattered. Ezekiel reminds them that God's presence had not disappeared. He was still speaking, still working, calling people toward Himself. The same God who met them in exile remained capable of bringing life into situations that looked beyond repair. And that is where this part of the journey leaves us. Learning that even in unfamiliar places, God's presence remains closer than we sometimes realize. As you move into the reading this week, remember there's no rush, read slowly, read a little at a time, or simply sit with the passage if that's what the week allows. Scripture doesn't ask us to perform, it invites us to remain. Everything connected to this journey lives in the show notes. It's all there in one place, so you don't have to go looking for it. Thank you for walking this long way with me, and I'll meet you here again next week.